In this screencast, I'm going to talk about some very basic good practice that I think you should adopt if you're working with data, and which will help you avoid very basic problems, anxieties that a lot of people have when they deal with data for the first time. Now, in order to do that, I want to start by making a distinction between two different types of data and the different types of work you might do with them. The first type of data is what I would call granular data. Granular data is basically data that goes down to the level of individual things. So in other words, here is the European Investment Bank database, which you can search and download the results. Down here there's an export link to download the search results as a spreadsheet. Now, this data is granular because each row of the data is an individual loan. So at the top we can see who the loan was to, where they were, what country, what sector, when it was signed and how much it was for, and so on. So this data isn't about the total of all the loans to a particular sector or region. It's about each individual loan. So that's granular data. The second type of data is what I would call aggregate data. Here, for example, we have some data from the Higher Education Statistics Agency on staffing in universities. Now, that particular data is rounded up. You get a number of staff per institution. So there isn't any great deal of detail in that, and so you're going to probably handle that differently. Once you've downloaded the data, it's going to appear and look something like this. So here we have the loans data that I mentioned before. This is granular, as I mentioned, a different row for each loan. And here we have the staffing data. We've got a different row for each institution. And as I say, this is aggregate data. So it's rounding up, it's adding up lots of individual elements. For example, here we can see there are 565 academic staff. If this was granular data, we might have a different row for each staff member. We might know how old they were, what department they worked in, what university they worked for, whether they were full-time or part-time, and so on. But because this isn't really granular data, it's aggregate data, we just get the great totals. Now I'm going to come on to how you might treat those data sets differently in a moment, but first I want to talk about what you do when you first get hold of a data set. A lot of data sets will have what I would call redundant rows, extra rows that you don't need. For example, if I go back to this loan data, you can see the first 5 rows here provide contextual information that you don't really need and is going to get in the way of anything you do. So the first thing you should always do with any data set is make a copy to start cleaning up and tidying a little bit. Now you can make a copy of a sheet in Excel by right-clicking on the sheet name at the bottom and selecting Move or Copy. And when you click on that, you will get a menu like this. Click on the drop-down menu and you can select a new spreadsheet, or you can create an extra copy in this spreadsheet. So I'm going to tick Create a Copy and I'm just going to click OK. Now once I've done that, I've now got the same sheet twice. So I've made a copy of my original data, loans, and here's the new sheet that is an exact copy of that. Now I'm going to call this working data. You can do that by double clicking on the tab or just right clicking and selecting rename. So the original data, loans, I'm going to leave alone. You should always keep a copy of the raw data untouched. Sometimes you might want to call it raw or raw data so you know which one it is, and you might want to save it somewhere else. Leave that to one side and make sure you do all your work on one copy, or at least one copy of that original data. The first thing, as I said, you should probably do is strip out these extra rows. You should always try and have data with headings on the first row. That will make it a lot easier to interrogate your data, as we'll see elsewhere. To delete rows in Excel, you click on the numbers of the rows and click and drag to select more than one. So if I click on number 1 and then hold the mouse button down and move until I've got 5 rows selected, I can now let go of the mouse button and right click on these numbers again and select delete. And that will just get rid of those first 5 rows that I don't really need and are only going to confuse Excel. I can do the same thing in my institutional data. So once again, I'm going to right click on the sheet name, make a copy, tick the box to create a copy and click OK, and then rename this new sheet working data. And now I can select the rows that I don't need so that my first row is a heading row. Now in some cases you'll have headings over more than one row, so we know that this is full-time academic staff. We can switch back to our original table to see that that's full-time academic, part-time academic, total academic, and then we've got total non-academic and total atypical. Now that's also disappeared from here, so we might want to clean up this or copy it across, let's say non-academic and atypical, to make sure that that heading row makes sense. The other thing you'll notice here is an empty row, and this is particularly problematic, and we'll have to get rid of that, as I'll come on to. But let's go back to the loans data, which is much easier to deal with, and I want to show you a couple of other simple things you should always do the first time you get hold of some data. We've gotten rid of those extra rows at the top, so we've made sure our first row is our heading row. The next thing to do is to check the limits, the borders, if you like, of our data. Now, one way to do that is to kind of scroll down endlessly and use the scroll bar to kind of go all the way down. But this has got thousands and thousands of rows, and that's going to take quite a long time. There's a much quicker way of doing this, and the quick way is a keyboard shortcut. On a PC, on a Windows machine, this shortcut is Control and the down arrow on your keyboard. On a Mac, it's Command and the down arrow. And if you hold down Command and the down arrow, you will be taken to the very last cell in whatever column you're in, or at least the last cell with any contents in it. So if I look at this final cell in my loans data, I can see that I've got a totals row. That's really important to check on any new data set, because if you have a row that gives you a grand total, then that might interfere with any calculations you're doing yourself. If you try to add up all of the totals in this spreadsheet, you would also be adding up the grand total, and you don't want to do that. So again, I'm going to right click on this row and I'm going to delete it. Now that shortcut works with all the arrow keys on your keyboard. So if I hold down Control and the right arrow, or Command and the right arrow on a Mac now, it will take me to the rightmost part of this particular row. So again, I can just see the edge of this data. If I hold Control and the up arrow, it will take me to the top, and Control and left will take me to the left. So just using these shortcuts, Control and down, Control and right, Control and up, Control and left, allows you to explore the limits of your data and check if there's anything that you don't want there, like grand totals, or if there are gaps that you need to deal with. If I switch back to my staffing data, for example, and put my cursor here and go Control and up, you'll notice it stops not at the top of the data, but at the top of all the cells with contents in it, because it stops whenever it hits an empty cell. That's why this empty row is a problem. Excel sees an empty row as the end of one set of data and the start of a new set of data. So as far as Excel is concerned, this first row is one table and this one is another. You can see this very easily if I position the cursor anywhere in this data and hold down Control and A to select all. It will only select the data it is sat within, so it's going to ignore this heading row. The key thing to remember is not necessarily all that detail, but just the principle that if you have an empty row, delete it. So I'm going to right click on row 2 and delete. Now I'm going to use those keyboard shortcuts to explore the edges of this data. So Control and down will take me down to the bottom, and I'm going to scroll down a bit to see what else there is there. So again, I can see that there's a gap here and some more data, but this is different data because we've got Aberystwyth again. And if I scroll back up to here, and use my shortcut again, I can see that maybe these are institutions for something else. So actually I can see, if we see that this is total England, we can see that these are going to be the Welsh universities. Now if we want to treat this data separately, that's fine. We'll probably want to put that in a separate data sheet. But again, using those cursor shortcuts provides a good way to find the limits of your data and check exactly what it includes and what it doesn't include. If we want to include the Welsh universities, then we can delete these 2 rows, which will bring it into the rest. So I'm going to do that. And again, I'm going to use that keyboard shortcut to find some extra empty rows and delete those. So I'm going to bring in the Scottish universities and the Northern Irish universities just by deleting those empty rows and the grand total rows, remember, so I'm going to get rid of total UK as well. Remember, we've got all this data anyway in our original table here, which we haven't altered. At the bottom of all of this, you'll also notice sometimes some footnotes. So we can see 0, 1 and 2 are rounded to 0. That's worth knowing. Also, all other numbers are rounded up or down to the nearest multiple of 5. And we can see, yes, 35, 5, 25. These are all very neat. So they're not absolutely accurate, but we know they're pretty much in the right region. This 0 here might mean 1 or 2. So look out for the footnotes as well. Those are all the kind of shortcuts and preparation I want to cover in this screencast. Just to sum up, there are 2 broad types of data. Aggregate data, which shows you general totals, and granular data, which gives you more detail on individual items. So for example, individual loans, individual items of spending, individual members of staff, and so on. Those 2 different types of data provide different opportunities. Granular data is generally better for finding stories because you have more detail, you can interpret it in different ways, you can aggregate it yourself. However, aggregate data you can't pick apart, you can't interrogate more, and generally you're going to be comparing it across different years. So there are 2 broad types of data which we're going to handle differently. Secondly, once you get some data open in a spreadsheet, make a copy of that data so that you can always check the original, work on the copy, use keyboard shortcuts to check the edges of that data, so Control and down, right, left and up to go to the edges of the data. Delete empty rows if you don't want to treat data separately, that is separated by empty rows, and also delete extra heading rows. You only want 1 row with all of your headings in, and that should be the very first row. Delete all other rows containing information that isn't a heading before that. That gets your data ready to be interrogated, and in a different screencast I'm going to talk about some of those techniques.